This is a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello, welcome to Undistracted, Season 6. I'm your host, Laura Bennett. So good to have you along as we learn from our guests how we can become better at living our lives intentionally around our passions, our purpose, and dealing with some of the stuff that can get in the way of that. If you're new to the show, subscribe wherever you're listening. You can find me on Instagram at laura.bennett_. And if you like emailing, you can do that anytime, undistracted@hope1032.com.au. If you've been listening for a while, you'll know that one of the reasons I started this show is because I genuinely believe each of us have unique things to contribute to the world, and that is what we should be living around, that we should be giving our time and our attention, our focus to. I believe there's God-given purpose on each of our lives and that we genuinely miss out collectively when each of us aren't offering those unique things. So the question I ask of us today is, what happens, what do we do when the thing distracting us from our purpose is religion? What happens if extreme ideology is blinding us from seeing true faith? What happens if Christian tradition is unwittingly derailing us from having a relationship with the God that it's meant to draw us toward? Our guest today is Tom Tilley. Tom is an Australian TV and radio presenter and journalist who made his name as the longtime host of Hack, Triple J's daily current affairs radio program. He's also reported for ABC TV's 7:30 and Foreign Correspondent programs, guest hosted ABC RN Breakfast and currently The Project on Network 10. Tom now also hosts a daily news podcast called The Briefing and has just released his memoir, Speaking in Tongues. In it, Tom tells the story of growing up in a strict religious community in Mudgee that prized the spiritual experience of speaking in tongues. Tom speaks about the doubts he began to have about the church's teachings and how, as he deconstructed this upbringing, it helped him build a life of greater sincerity and meaning. Let's welcome Tom to the show.
Great to be here.
Your memoir, Speaking in Tongues, it is a truly fascinating read, and I wanted to ask you, what were you taught about the significance of speaking in tongues to your faith? What did it mean?
Yeah, well, in the church I was born into, it meant everything. They defined the whole organisation on this doctrinal position that you had to speak in tongues in order to be saved. And so for people of my parents' generation, people who came later in life, they had what felt like a really powerful spiritual experience, which formed really the basis for their faith. And then this organisation was sort of largely built around this experience and its doctrinal position. But for us kids, that put us in a bit of a strange position where we knew from our very early years that at some point we would have to have this mystical spiritual experience, that at some point God would have to decide to give us this gift in order for us to apparently be saved and therefore to remain members of our church community, the people that understood us and loved us most. So it slowly dawned on us that the love that we had in our church community was conditional.
When you saw people speaking in tongues in church, was it something that you were intrigued by? Did you think it was special? Did you think it was a little bit strange? How did you react to it?
Well, on one hand, it was really normal. Like I didn't have a memory where that wasn't a part of my life. You know, several nights a week we were at church gatherings where people were speaking out in tongues. So on that level, it was very normal, but there was a lot of reverence for it. You know, I truly believed it was a gift from God. It was a truly spiritual experience that people were having. And when I heard the adults do it, it was convincing. Like they spoke in these like complex, nuanced languages. They really sounded like full languages. And that was what we hoped to have. But for most of us kids, what came out of our mouths was a lot less convincing.
What impact rather did it have on you to think that your community, the relationship you had to God, was conditional on having that particular ability to speak in tongues?
Well, it just made it all kind of heavy. you know, any questions you had about it, any doubts or fears, you didn't dare voice them out of fear of being ostracized.
And there was a lot of rules within the Revival Centre community that you started to have some issue with, particularly when you were around that age of 10 years of age, questioning the idea of speaking in tongues and some of the other structure. What prompted those feelings of unease with the church?
Well, initially I was pretty fine with it all. You know, it didn't really, you know, as a 13, 14-year-old, it didn't really limit my life much at all. You know, there were little things that made me realise we were different. I firstly got a bit embarrassed by the evangelising that our parents would do in the main street of town. And then the rules started to kick in a bit harder, like no girlfriends, no drinking, no dancing, kind of this overriding encouragement not to get too deep in your friendships with people outside the church, which really did not work for me. And as my story plays out, you get a sense that my parents weren't even really signed up to the most hardline parts of the church policy. And so we always were a bit more liberal than the letter of the law in our church. And it was literally a letter. We got handed out a set of printed out guidelines at our young people's camps every year. And it was really, so yeah, you know, when everyone else was having sex at school, I wasn't. You know, when everyone else was getting drunk for the first time, I wasn't. I didn't mind the drinking thing. It didn't look that appealing, to be honest. They looked disgusting a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Not having relationships I found a little bit harder, but still I wasn't really pushed that hard to hang on to our sort of standards. But when I left home and had more space to think, and my doubts about speaking in tongues got more airtime in my head, and I felt alone. And also when I left my own church, the Mudgee branch of the Revival Centre, where my dad was the pastor, who was relatively liberal, when I moved to Sydney that had a more hardline, legalistic pastor, and also in a bigger church group, the sort of accountability, transparency, and the need to conform to the rules that were so clearly laid out was a lot more intense. So I really had to make that church community the center of my world. Whereas in Mudgee, I'd had both worlds, and both worlds were quite healthy.
Yeah.
My school town life, my sporting life was great, apart from being reined in on Sunday sport.
Yep.
And my church life was great too. I love the people I went to church with. You know, we went to these amazing camps, and that feeling, you know, maybe I'm not sure what sort of Christian life you've had, but those moments of togetherness in a Christian community are unbelievable. They're so beautiful. We'd get towards the end of these children's camps or the Christmas camps, and we didn't want them to end. We didn't want to go back out into the world, you know. We were surrounded by people that understood us and got our sense of humor and got our challenges and limitations. So yeah, it was beautiful. And it's only through like really looking at my story that I've understood more of the dynamics that were at play there. And while a lot of the things the church did were not, in some ways they weren't that extreme, or, you know, my story's not about abuse or anything like that, like physical abuse or sexual abuse. It's about the threat of being cut off from the people you love.
Yeah.
And actually, that is actually kind of extreme, even though it doesn't look like it. You know, human connection and your relationship with your most important community, that's right up there with air, water, and shelter in terms of human needs.
What were some of the dynamics that you noticed that framed that idea of unhealthy rules around the way you could be rejected from community or otherwise? Were there certain things that were happening that said, you know, what you're doing is unacceptable and you will be separated?
Yeah. Yep. So we saw examples of people getting kicked out for going to the wedding of an ex-member. Or, you know, we lost a good friend out of the church who had oral sex and was kicked out forever. You know, a close friend, someone we knew since the age of 3, and we were told not to speak to him anymore.
Wow.
But we did. And when I later left the church, I moved him into my share house so that, you know, he wasn't left out on his own anymore.
Yeah.
As a bit of a pushback to the church, but also wanting to help him. So, and we saw countless examples of people literally kicked out of the church. So we knew it was real.
Was it strange to you that in some ways you were demonstrating behaviours of acceptance, of openness, as someone who was resisting kind of the church, compared to the people within the church who teach these ideas of acceptance and openness, but it wasn't coming from them, instead it was coming from you, this quote-unquote rebel?
Yeah. I mean, it was just blatantly obvious to me, and that's why I made the decision to leave. Other Christians that I met painted the more sort of compassionate portrait of Christ. And that, to be honest, sounded a lot more fun, to be out there doing things in the world, supporting people, lifting people up, not sitting around like reading the rules to your own church and deciding who's in or out. And that was a bit of an epiphany for me. It's like, I want to live a bold, positive life, not a negative, reductive life. And that was the turning point for me.
And the focus on speaking in tongues is something that obviously is very central to part of what caused you doubt within the Revival Centre community. But was it the emphasis on speaking in tongues that was such an issue for you, or some of the theology of Christianity as a whole?
I would break it into two categories. I would say it was a problem with the theology or the doctrine of speaking in tongues, and then the culture of the organisation, the sort of hardline rules-based nature of it, letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law, so to speak, kind of approach. But the two things I think are intrinsically linked. I think that the hardline position on speaking in tongues was almost like the cancer, and then the culture of the organisation was they were symptoms of that problem. Because once you have a different doctrinal position to the rest of the Christian community, then you need to delineate, and to do that requires rules. And so one flowed onto the other, even though I sort of tackled them as slightly separate obstacles.
So would you say that the Revival Centres, in your experience, because it kind of to some would read like a cult or, like a real sect. Do you see it that way as well?
Yeah, I do. I was a little bit careful. Like, I didn't use the word cult in the book. I don't know if you picked up on that. I chose the word sect, and I've been picked up on that actually in another podcast I did with some ex-fundamentalists. A very interesting one called I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist.
I love that podcast.
They said, what? Do you? Okay, that's
good.
Interesting, yeah. They said, why did you choose sect and not cult? And I think the word cult is used so broadly and a bit indiscriminately, and carries a lot of baggage that doesn't necessarily apply to this situation in this group, despite the fact that some of it definitely does. Sect, after speaking to some sociologists who've researched this space, is a definition that is really about a group that's defined by its doctrinal position. And at its core, I felt like that's what the Revival Centre was, even though that led to some cultish elements. So yes, it's a sect, no doubt about it. Is it a cult? In some ways, yes. In some ways, no.
Yeah, and it's good that you really gave such consideration to it, because there would obviously be people still within that community and others like it that feel very passionate about the experiences they've had there and the truth of what their own experiences have been like. But I wonder as well, in your teen years, when you started to move away from the church and you really were able to act out on seeing life outside what you'd been brought up in, what was it about that alternative kind of life that really appealed to you?
The freedom, the adventure. And while I was young at high school, I could have that. I could have both. But once I was sort of, as I said before, in the Sydney Assembly, where they really tried to keep me separate from the world and I couldn't do both, then it didn't stack up anymore. And I write about in the book how my parents would get up in church and give their testimonies, as we called it, and they talk about all the bad things that happened before they found God. And I was like, they sound like good things. You traveled overseas, you went through the Middle East, you lived in Arnhem Land with Indigenous people, you went to uni and got in the hippie movement, and had issues and challenges that kind of left you a little bit empty-handed or broken-hearted in some ways. But that sounds like life. Not the second half of your testimony where I received the Holy Spirit speaking in tongues and God's blessed me ever since. That bit sounded very boring.
Yeah. And it's funny that you say that. And I really did notice this within the book, because I know, like, even in the youth groups and things that I've been part of, like, you'd hear someone come in with this testimony of, like, we used to be a drug dealer on the streets and then, God found me kind of thing. And you'd kind of go, well, what's my testimony if I've literally gone from being a Christian to still being a Christian? But there's kind of this, I suppose, narrative within the church sometimes that if you're brought up in church as you were compared to your parents, that you've saved yourself from having the mistakes, that you don't have to walk the journey that your parents have to find this answer that everyone else is actually trying to find. Do you think that we do miss out on something being raised in the church as opposed to being outside of the church and finding it, because we start life with this inherent set of beliefs and a culture and a community, that, like, we're born into a structure as opposed to finding it for ourselves?
I reckon it's a massive challenge for probably every Christian to reconcile that, and so it's very different. I'm guessing by the fact that you're having this kind of conversation, that you've invited someone like me onto your podcast, that you're from a much more liberal end of the Christian community than the one I grew up in. And I wonder what that would have been like, what that would have been like for you, because I had some obvious things to push back against, Just blatantly obvious, ridiculous things that just didn't make sense. But if you grow up in a great, supportive Christian community who, has pretty good social values and all the things that I think can be good about Christianity, like doing good works, caring about your community, displaying the values of Jesus Christ, for example, I think you could end up still feeling a bit sheltered and wondering what your life would have been like if you'd been born from a different family, So, I mean, how do you answer that question about how your life might have been if you had different exposures?
Yeah, I do wonder sometimes, and maybe more now, because I see that, I think there's things you ask yourself, and I think you had this similar experience where you're going, is what I'm wanting to do in life based on what I personally want to do, or is it an influence of the structures that I observed? So it's like what things are my personal opinion and what things are an opinion that is just so embedded into me. And you do start to find, and like, I know, like, within teenage years and probably into adulthood too, you do start to kind of go, why do I actually believe that? What's my opinion on this? And is it something, like you mentioned earlier, that is something that comes from Christian tradition, or is it actually from what Scripture says and what the truth of Jesus teaches us?
And that's a great point and very well expressed. And that's actually it's what my book is really about. It's deconstructing what you inherited and working out which bits are truthful for you. And so I think we all have to go through that. Everyone born into a religious upbringing has to go through that to some extent. Mine was a fairly extreme version because I was in extreme church where I knocked the wall that was built for me, I knocked the whole thing over. And I decided very slowly, very carefully, which bricks to put back in my wall so that my foundations as a person were solid. I wonder, do you feel like you've gone through a version of that in any way?
I love that this interview is too. I love that it's flipping around, like going through the bricks. I think I'm probably in, like, I've always been a very curious, questioning kind of person. So there's always been elements where as the bricks were being put on by my family or by my community, I would kind of think about them as they were there. But then as your life experience deepens, then you start to look back at the ones that are there and then maybe think about that a little bit more. But I've lived overseas as a child. I've traveled a lot. And so I think that has probably been something that's worked in my favor, that even though I lived in a relatively, I had a Christian upbringing, there was also so many other things pouring into it as well.
I can totally get how that would make all the difference. Like, that's the word I used before, sheltered. If you felt really, if your faith made you feel sheltered from the full range of human experiences, then I think you're going to be left questioning, have you lived a full life? But if you grew up in a Christian family that had lots of exposure to different elements of the human experience, then I can imagine you still be satisfied with the path that you didn't choose, because the path was interesting. And in that path, you got to feel things out for yourself by living those experiences. It's a tricky one, though. It's an interesting challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, it is tricky, and I think it's ongoing. And I think travel, honestly, like that's one of the times in your life that seems to have opened things up for you. But I think it's one of the most important things, because going to Beijing and different places, I'd look around at what's there and I thought, if Christianity was here, if this place had a Christian flavor to it, what would happen to this culture and these traditions and these really beautiful things that exist so outside of Western Christian tradition? What would happen to all of that if you, from the Christian perspective, that you want everybody to know Jesus and you want everybody to have that relationship, what would that take away and what would that allow to thrive? I think is a really important question to ask.
Well, it's a bit of a dangerous question, though, as a true Christian, isn't it? Because if the answer is that if everyone followed Christ and not their own belief structures, that we would have a society that's not as interesting or as vibrant or as good. I mean, what do you do if that's the answer you come to? Yeah. Because I totally get, as a non-believer now, I totally get the appreciating the ideas that Jesus brought to the table that were actually revolutionary in their time, right? So I on board with that, but I can't get on board with this is the only savior and the other pathways are not a journey to salvation. That's a much harder position to justify, I think.
Yeah, and I think too, the one thing that I often think about is that all of us are made in the image of God. That's a fundamental Christian belief, that every single one of us are created in his image. So I know for me, I go, whether someone holds a different view from me, they still display an aspect of the character of God. And so I always think, what is it in them that reveals something about God that I can learn? Because you carry an aspect of his image in you. I do as well, and so does the next person. So what can we understand about God through each other, even if they are someone who has different experiences from your own?
Well, what if you replace God in that sentence for good? That you see the good in other people and that you can learn about being good through their perspective and that sort of thing. It just slightly broadens it, and you're looking for the positive, the divine, the beauty in human spirit and decision making. And maybe all these different religions, that if you are of the view of sort of following one rather than more of a pluralist view, then it's hard to know how you embrace those other positions. But ultimately they may be cultural settings or ideas, religions that are getting you to a very similar point of connecting with the divine, whatever that is. But I'm straying outside my lane here, but it's a good conversation.
No, it's fascinating to think about. And you mentioned you're not a believer anymore. So is that not a believer in Christianity, or do you not believe in God at all anymore?
Yeah, I'm not. What happened on my journey is I realized the Revival Centre had it wrong. And I got a bit of a tough, I've had so little negative feedback to my book. It's been really lovely. I did have one person write to me, and this was a bit of a challenging point. It was like, I'm so glad you left a toxic church, but I'm really sad that you lost your faith. And so my journey, I went to several other Christian churches after leaving the Revival Centre, went into the broader, more charismatic neo-Pentecostal world, C3, Christian Life Centre. Didn't feel right to me on a couple of levels. Ended up in this youth arm of the local Anglican church in Manly in Sydney. And they really boiled down what I think real Christianity is. And it's just so simple. It's none of that those extra layers that the Pentecostal movement brings. It's actually just truly believing in Jesus and him being your savior. I think that's what a Christian really is. But once I realized that and I saw what that meant to other people, the people getting up and saying how much they love Jesus and how much he was like a friend and a hero to them. And I was like, I don't feel that. I respect his ideas immensely, but do I believe in the creation, the Son of God, the crucifixion, the resurrection, the Holy Spirit coming down? Not really. And when I really am honest with myself, I never truly did. So that was my journey away from faith. But then I guess your question goes a step further than that. Is there still some kind of belief or faith? In some ways, yes. And then in other ways, I do think that science gives us the best explanation we have for where we find ourselves. Definitely not perfect, nowhere near all of the story. But then at the same time, do I feel like these like powerful moments of connection? Yes. Do I feel the awesomeness of this creation we live in when I look at, say, the huge mountains or beautiful oceans and the natural world? Do I see this wonderful complexity that blows science out of the water?
Yeah.
Yes. So I feel like I feel this special sense of awe, and I'm not closed off to spiritual connection. So label me what you want.
You just want it to be authentic by the sounds of it.
Definitely want it to be authentic. And I definitely don't need an answer. That's the other thing I came to. I gave up on perfection. I think it's a mirage and a dangerous one, and drove a lot of the Puritans that took our church too far to the hard line. I think it's beautiful. I have an awe in not knowing. I think that's exciting. Pretending that no. I don't find that a beautiful thing. I find that I just can't get on board with that.
It's a bit rigid. I actually heard someone say recently, a guy named, I think it was Owen McManus, he said that he finds it interesting that people who reject the idea of God often find themselves more interested in science and, the universe kind of influencing our lives. And he put it this way, that the universe is an echo and that the original voice is that of God. What do you think about that idea?
I guess that depends on how you see how it all began, which comes first. And yeah, I guess you're moving into territory where you're thinking about God in a much broader sense than, the 7 days, the man responsible for the creation, which is obviously steeped in kind of cultural assumptions as well of the time of the Bible was written, I guess. So that's a big, massive question. I'm not sure where to go with that one.
No, that's all right. It is a big one. No, just what you said just made me think of it. But I know we are kind of wrapping up on time. So I want to ask you a question that I generally ask a lot of our guests. And for you, I think it's around the idea that, a successful life from what the revival centres would have set it up to be like, I imagine is quite different from what you view a successful life being now. So to you, what is your idea of a successful life, and how would you live in undistracted pursuit of that version of success?
For me, a successful life is a very well-rounded life. So here are my tick boxes for a successful life: a good relationship with your family, a good relationship with your close and wider community, behaving ethically, which means essentially do unto others as they'll do unto you. For me, it also involves career satisfaction and doing work that resonates with your values, but also harnesses your strengths. Being open to change is crucial for a successful life. Being compassionate to people that need compassion, but also just to people who have different views to yours. And then I guess tied in with the career satisfaction is just basic material gain. And, as someone with a young baby who maybe you can hear squealing in the background,
Squeal, yep.
It's the kind of the old-fashioned provider thing as well. So that's part of the picture for me as well, personally.
Well, Tom, go ahead.
Oh, well, look, I just wanted to say that it's really nice to be speaking to a Christian audience, and it really, hopefully you picked this up from the way I told my story and dissected the good from the bad and tried to celebrate that. I find it really touching to be invited on a podcast like this, and also some of the reactions I've had from Christians who are still believers who've picked up my book, and this amazing response just this week, someone saying, I was a fan of Tom on Hack, and I thought, so I was always going to pick up his book, but I thought as a Christian I'd cop a hammering, and I was, really stoked to see that he was able to delineate between, an unhealthy organisation and the good parts of Christianity and faith-inspired work. So I hate echo chambers. Well, I left the Revival Centre, so for me, it means a lot to, as someone who is not a Christian anymore, to still be in conversation and connected and crossing over the echo chambers between what is often too much of a binary in our society.
Yeah, well, it has been an absolute pleasure having you, and you do a brilliant job, I think, in speaking in tongues of sharing your want to make sure that no one feels excluded in your journey of exploration, and even some of the times on air where you felt yourself needing to go, hang on a minute, am I telling this story the right way as a journalist in an unbiased way? So again, Tom, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real joy having you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Tom Tilley, genuinely one of my favourite guests on the show so far. I love that while he's struggled with aspects of his spirituality, he gives us an example of what it looks like to consider intentionally each of the beliefs, the ideas that we might have been brought up believing. And while he may have landed in a different place to where some of us might, I'm sure there's varying perspectives around all of the different things Tom brought up in this conversation. I really appreciate that he gave us the time to talk through some of them, and that he does show us what it means to think deeply about the narratives we build our lives around. Tom's memoir, Speaking in Tongues, is out now. It's a fascinating read if you're willing to dive in a little deeper to the behind the scenes of some people's experience of faith. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Undistracted. Rate it, review it. Would love to hear your thoughts as well. You can reach out on Instagram at laura.bennett_ or email me undistracted@hope1032.com.au. Until next time, enjoy living this undistracted life.
This is a Hope 1032 production. Thanks for listening.